The air in the Monocacy Valley of Maryland always feels a bit heavier in late October. It is a land of rolling fog, where the skeletal fingers of oak trees reach out from the mist to scrape against the sides of old, weather-beaten barns. For Julian, this landscape didn't feel like home. It felt like a graveyard of memories he had spent most of his life trying to avoid. But when the letter arrived from a dusty law office in Frederick, informing him that his grandfather had left him the Blackwood estate, Julian found himself driving down the winding, gravel roads of his childhood once again. The house stood at the end of a long, overgrown driveway, a Victorian relic that seemed to be sagging under the weight of its own history. The gray paint was peeling like dead skin, and the wraparound porch groaned as Julian stepped onto it. He had spent summers here as a boy, but he remembered his grandfather, Silas, as a man of few words and many locks. Silas was a man who lived in the corners of rooms, always watching the floorboards, always listening to the wind. Inside, the house smelled of cedar, old paper, and a faint, metallic tang that Julian couldn't quite place. Most of the furniture was covered in white sheets, making the rooms look like they were inhabited by ghosts waiting for a party to begin. Julian moved through the kitchen, noting the layer of dust that coated everything. It was here, tucked behind a heavy swinging door that led to a walk-in pantry, that he found the anomaly. In the corner of the pantry, where a normal wooden door should have led down to the cellar, there was something else entirely. A massive slab of gray concrete had been poured directly into the doorframe, sealing it from floor to ceiling. Over the concrete, 3 heavy iron bars had been bolted into the studs of the wall. It wasn't just closed, it was buried. Julian ran his hand over the rough surface. It was unnervingly cold, colder than the autumn air outside. As he touched the concrete, a low, rhythmic thud echoed from behind the barrier. It wasn't a loud sound, but it was deep, like a heartbeat felt through the soles of his shoes. Julian pulled his hand back, his heart racing. He told himself it was just the house settling, or perhaps a trapped animal, but the scratch marks on the outside of the seal caught his eye. They weren't made by a tool. They looked like fingernail grooves, dug deep into the wood of the doorframe by someone or something trying to keep the concrete in. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting long, distorted shadows across the kitchen floor, Julian sat at the wooden table with a flashlight and his grandfather's old keychain. He felt a strange pull toward that sealed door. In rural Maryland, folks have a saying, "Some doors are closed for a reason, and some are closed for a season." But 40 years seemed like more than a season, felt like a sentence. He remembered his grandfather's final words to him years ago. "Julian, never mind the roots of this house. Just tend to the branches." At the time, he thought it was a poetic way of telling him to stay out of family drama. Now, looking at the iron-reinforced concrete in his pantry, he realized Silas might have been literal. The basement was the root and something was rotting down there. The silence of the house was interrupted by a sharp rap at the back door. Julian jumped, his flashlight rolling across the table. When he opened the door, he found Mr. Henderson, a local farmer whose face looked like a map of the county's roughest winters. Henderson didn't offer a greeting. He just looked past Julian toward the pantry and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "You shouldn't have come back, boy," Henderson said, his voice like gravel in a tin can. "Silas spent 40 years making sure that Hole stayed quiet. He didn't do it for him. He did it for us. The Maryland soil doesn't like to be disturbed once it's been patted down." Henderson warned him that if he heard a ringing in his ears that sounded like silver bells, he should leave the house and never look back. Julian tried to laugh it off, offering a polite thanks, but the old man just shook his head and walked back into the fog. Left alone, Julian found his gaze drifting back to the pantry. The curiosity was a slow-burning fire in his chest. Why would a man spend his final years living above a tomb of concrete? What could be so precious or so terrible that it required iron bars in a kitchen? He picked up a small hand sledge from a toolbox he'd brought from the city. He tapped the concrete slab lightly. The sound that came back wasn't the dull thwack of solid stone. It was a hollow, echoing ring, a vibration that seemed to travel up his arm and settle in the back of his skull. For a moment, the temperature in the room dropped so sharply he could see his own breath. A soft, rhythmic scratching started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the walls of the kitchen, moving upward toward the ceiling. Julian backed away, his breath hitching in his throat. He realized then that the basement wasn't just a room. It was a heart, and by entering the house, he had started it beating again. As he lay in bed that night in his old upstairs room, the house felt alive. The wind outside howled through the Maryland pines, sounding like 1,000 voices whispering a single word he couldn't quite understand. He thought about the concrete seal, 40 years of silence, and the heavy iron bars. He knew that tomorrow he wouldn't be able to resist. He would find out what his grandfather had hidden. The moral of the story, Julian would soon learn, is that some secrets are not meant to be shared, and some burdens are too heavy for one soul to carry. But as the moon rose over the Blackwood estate, the ringing Henderson had warned him about began. A faint, silver chime that seemed to come from right beneath his floorboards. The seal was still intact, but the house was already breathing, and the basement was waiting. The morning light in Maryland is usually a gentle thing, a soft amber glow that filters through the thick canopy of oak and maple trees. But as the sun rose over the Blackwood estate the following day, the light felt intrusive, as if it were trying to expose secrets that were never meant to be seen. Julian stood in the kitchen, a cold cup of coffee in his hands, staring at the concrete-sealed door in the pantry. The ringing in his ears had faded into a dull thrum, a vibration that felt like it was coming from the very soles of his feet. He knew he shouldn't do it. The warnings from Mr. Henderson and the cryptic advice from his grandfather's past were like red flags waving in a gale. Yet, there is a specific type of weight that an unsolved mystery carries, a gravity that pulls at the mind until resistance feels like a physical ache. Julian picked up the phone. He needed someone with more than a hand sledge. He needed someone who didn't know the local legends, someone who wouldn't look at the house with the same fearful eyes as the neighbors. By noon, a battered white pickup truck pulled into the gravel driveway. Out stepped Marcus, a man whose skin was the color of well-oiled leather and whose hands were calloused from decades of demolition work. Marcus was from 2 counties over. He didn't care about ringing bells or the superstitions of the Monocacy Valley. He just cared about the hourly rate. He looked at the sealed door, whistled low, and shook his head. Whatever your granddaddy was trying to keep out, he sure didn't want it using the stairs, Marcus remarked, unloading a heavy-duty jackhammer and a set of industrial chisels. The work began with a violence that felt out of place in the quiet house. The roar of the jackhammer tore through the silence of the Blackwood estate, sending vibrations through the walls that made the old portraits in the hallway tilt and shiver. Julian stood back, the dust mask tight against his face, watching as Marcus attacked the concrete. For the first hour, the slab held firm. It was high-grade material, reinforced with more than just iron. Julian noticed flecks of what looked like crushed seashells and dark, obsidian-like stones mixed into the aggregate. As the second hour began, the air in the kitchen started to change. It didn't just get dusty. It grew heavy and humid, like the air right before a summer thunderstorm. A smell began to seep out from the hairline fractures forming in the seal. It wasn't the smell of a damp basement or rotting wood. It was something more complex, the scent of ancient, dried rose petals mixed with the sharp, ozone tang of a lightning strike. Marcus paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Strange smell," he muttered, his bravado wavering for the first time. Like a funeral parlor in July. Julian felt a sudden, sharp impulse to tell Marcus to stop. Every instinct in his body was screaming that he was making a catastrophic mistake. But then, a loud crack echoed through the room, a sound like a bone snapping. A large chunk of the concrete fell inward, vanishing into the pitch-black void of the staircase below. The moment the seal was breached, the house seemed to exhale. A sudden, violent gust of freezing wind rushed out of the hole, blowing past them with such force that it knocked the spices off the pantry shelves and extinguished the work lights Marcus had set up. The wind didn't just feel cold. It felt old. It carried the weight of 40 years of stagnant silence, a pressure that made Julian's ears pop painfully. Marcus stumbled back, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He dropped the jackhammer, the heavy tool clattering onto the floorboards. "I'm done," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "I don't care about the rest of the money. There's something wrong with the air in there. That ain't no normal cellar, kid. That's a throat." Without waiting for a response, Marcus gathered his gear with frantic haste. He didn't even bother to coil his extension cords, simply dragging them behind him as he bolted for the front door. Julian stood alone in the kitchen, the silence that followed the contractor's departure feeling heavier than the noise that had preceded it. The hole in the wall was only about a foot wide, a jagged eye looking into a darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow the light from the kitchen windows. Julian approached the hole, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He held his flashlight up, the beam cutting a weak path into the dark. He expected to see stairs, perhaps some old cobwebs or discarded crates. Instead, the light hit nothing. The stairs were there, made of dark, heavy timber, but they seemed to descend much further than the foundation of the house should have allowed. And then he heard it. From the bottom of the darkness, far below the floorboards of the Maryland kitchen, came a sound that froze the blood in Julian's veins. It wasn't a groan or a monster's growl. It was the clear, melodic sound of a child's laugh. It was a joyful, innocent sound, yet in the context of a 40-year-old concrete tomb, it was the most terrifying thing Julian had ever heard. The laugh echoed up the stairwell, bouncing off the damp walls, sounding closer with every repetition. Julian stepped back, his hand shaking so hard he nearly dropped the flashlight. He realized then that his haste had been his undoing. He had been so focused on what was behind the door that he hadn't stopped to consider why it had been put there. The seal wasn't a challenge to be overcome. It was a mercy that had been granted to the world above. By breaking the concrete, he hadn't just opened a room, he had broken a fast. The moral of this chapter is a bitter pill to swallow. Haste is the enemy of wisdom, and in our rush to uncover the truth, we often destroy the very safeguards that keep us whole. Julian had acted out of a restless curiosity, ignoring the steady, quiet warnings of those who knew better. Now the boundary was broken, and the safety of the Blackwood estate was a thing of the past. As the sun began to set, casting the kitchen into deep, orange-hued shadows, Julian realized the laughing had stopped. In its place was a new sound, the soft, wet thud of something climbing the stairs, one slow, deliberate step at a time. The ringing in his ears returned, louder than ever, and he realized with a jolt of horror that the sound wasn't bells at all. It was the sound of something silver scraping against the wood. The basement was open, and whatever had been waiting for 40 years was finally coming up for air. The silence that followed the wet, rhythmic thumping on the stairs was more suffocating than the sound itself. Julian stood frozen in the center of the kitchen, his flashlight beam trembling like a dying star. The thing on the stairs had stopped just below the threshold, where the kitchen floorboards met the jagged remains of the concrete seal. He could hear it breathing, not a lung-filled breath, but a sound like wind whistling through a hollow pipe. The air in the kitchen grew so cold that the windows frosted over in a matter of seconds, obscuring the moonlight and trapping him in a world of silver and shadow. Realizing that standing still was a death sentence, Julian felt a surge of desperate, ancestral courage. If he was to die in this house, he wouldn't do it cowering in a corner. He reached for a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth and, with his flashlight in the other, he stepped toward the breach. He expected a monster, a clawed beast, or a vengeful spirit. Instead, as the beam of his light dipped into the stairwell, he saw nothing but the stairs themselves. The presence had retreated into the darkness, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. The descent into the basement felt like a descent into another century. The stairs were made of ancient Maryland heartwood, dense and black with age. As Julian reached the bottom, his flashlight revealed that this was no ordinary cellar. The walls were not made of dirt or stone, but of thousands of hand-blown glass jars, stacked neatly on cedar shelves that reached from the floor to the high, arched ceiling. The basement was massive, stretching far beyond the footprint of the house above, a subterranean cathedral of glass and secrets. As Julian moved deeper into the room, he realized the jars were not empty. Each one contained a swirling, pearlescent mist that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow. It was beautiful, in a haunting, unnatural way. He leaned closer to one jar, labeled in his grandfather's precise, looping cursive, Abigail Thorne, 1954, the memory of her first dance. Inside, the mist shifted, and for a fleeting second, Julian saw a tiny, translucent face through the glass. Not screaming, but frozen in a look of profound, hollow longing. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His grandfather, Silas, hadn't been a hoarder of things. He had been a collector of moments. But as he looked at the jars around him, he saw that the mists were beginning to turn. In the jars near the broken seal, the pearlescent white was curdling into a bruised purple, then a pitch black. The faces inside were no longer peaceful. They were contorted in silent agony, their mouths wide as if letting out a scream that the glass refused to release. The hollow man his grandfather had trapped was not a creature of flesh, but a void that fed on these preserved lives. In the center of the room stood a heavy oak desk, covered in ledgers and ink-stained quills. Behind a loose brick in the pillar next to the desk, Julian found what he had been looking for. A small, leather-bound diary with a lock made of tarnished silver. He didn't need a key. The lock crumbled into dust at his touch, as if the book itself was desperate to be read. He flipped to the final entries, dated just days before Silas had sealed the basement 40 years ago. "The hunger cannot be sated," the diary read. "I thought I was preserving the beauty of this town, keeping their joys safe from the passage of time. But the weight of 1,000 stolen memories has birthed something else, a shadow that wears the faces of the forgotten. I have seen it in the corner of my eye, a man with no features, only the echoes of the voices I took. I must seal the vault. If the world forgets these moments, so be it. Better to live in the dark than to be eaten by the past." Julian dropped the book, his heart cold. He looked at the shelves and saw a jar at the very end of the row, tucked away in the deepest shadow. It was empty, save for a small slip of paper at the bottom. He shone his light on the label. It read, "Julian, the day he forgets his grandfather." A wave of nausea washed over him. Silas hadn't just been protecting the town. He had been preparing to take Julian's own history to feed the collection. The soft, wet thud returned, but this time it was coming from behind him, near the desk. Julian spun around, his light catching a tall, spindly figure standing amidst the jars. It had no face, only a shifting surface of gray smoke that mimicked the features of the people in the jars. A nose here, a weeping eye there, a child's mouth that opened to let out that same terrifying, innocent laugh. The hollow man reached out a hand made of mist, and the glass jars nearby began to vibrate and crack. "You shouldn't have opened the door, Julian," the entity whispered, its voice a discordant choir of 100 different townspeople. "We were so hungry in the dark. We have forgotten who we are. Give us your eyes. Give us your name. Let us remember through you." The entity moved with a sickening, fluid grace, its presence draining the light from Julian's flashlight until the beam was nothing more than a dull orange flicker. Julian backed away, his boots crunching on the glass of a shattered jar. As the mist from the broken jar touched his skin, he felt a sudden, sharp memory of a summer fair he'd never attended. The smell of funnel cake, the sound of a carousel. And then, just as quickly, the memory was ripped away, leaving a cold, aching hole in his mind. The entity wasn't just killing him. It was unmaking him, piece by precious piece. The moral of this discovery was a bitter truth. Some things are better left forgotten for the sake of peace. Julian had sought the truth of his heritage, but the truth was a parasite that had been waiting for a new host. By digging into the roots of his family tree, he had uncovered a rot that threatened to consume his very identity. The past is a beautiful place to visit, but to dwell there, to try and bottle it, is to invite a hunger that can never be filled. Julian reached the base of the stairs, but the hollow man was faster, its smoke-like form drifting over the jars like a shroud. He looked up toward the kitchen, toward the light of the world he knew, but the opening seemed miles away. The ringing in his ears was now a deafening roar of voices, all pleading to be remembered. As the first jar on the bottom shelf exploded from the pressure of the entity's presence, Julian realized he couldn't run. He had to find a way to silence the voices before they silenced him. But as he looked into the eyeless face of the shadow, he saw his own reflection starting to fade from the glass of the surrounding jars. The transition from the freezing, pressurized air of the basement to the stale warmth of the kitchen was like surfacing from a deep-sea dive. Julian scrambled up the stairs, his boots slipping on the timber, and didn't stop until he had slammed the pantry door shut. He shoved a heavy oak hutch in front of the door, his chest heaving, but he knew the gesture was symbolic at best. You cannot barricade a door against a mist. You cannot lock out a sound. As he slumped against the wall, the ringing in his ears settled into a low, mournful hum, like the vibration of a distant hive. He expected the house to feel safer once the door was sealed again, but the Blackwood estate had already begun to transform. The Maryland moonlight, usually a silver comfort, now felt clinical and harsh as it cut through the windows. Julian noticed that the shadows in the kitchen were no longer behaving according to the laws of physics. The shadow of the refrigerator stretched toward him even as the light source stayed still. The shadow of the ceiling fan didn't spin with the blades. It hung motionless on the floor like a giant, dark spider. As Julian retreated toward the stairs to the second floor, he felt a profound sense of isolation. He wanted to call Mr. Henderson or even the police, but the weight of his grandfather's secret held his tongue. How do you tell the world that your family legacy is a cellar full of stolen souls? He reached the upstairs hallway, his flashlight flickering. The batteries should have been fresh, but the house seemed to be drinking the energy from the air itself. Every step he took felt like wading through knee-deep water. The conflict of the night began in the hallway bathroom. Julian paused to splash cold water on his face, hoping to shock himself out of what he desperately wanted to believe was a hallucination. He kept his eyes down, focusing on the ceramic sink. But when he looked up into the medicine cabinet mirror, His breath hitched. The reflection staring back at him was delayed. He watched his own image stand still for a full second after he had moved. Then the reflection slowly reached up and touched its own throat, even though Julian's hands were gripped tight to the edge of the sink. The reflection's eyes were not his own. They were the swirling, pearlescent mist of the jars. His double opened its mouth, and instead of a voice, the sound of 1,000 whispering secrets poured out from the glass. Julian stumbled back, the mirror cracking with a sharp ping that echoed through the silent house. He realized then that the Hollow Man wasn't just in the basement anymore. It had used the broken seal to infect the very architecture of the manor. The house was no longer a shelter. It was a digestive tract. Fear, cold and paralyzing, began to settle into his bones. He retreated to his bedroom, the only room that still held a ghost of his childhood innocence, and locked the door. He sat on the edge of the bed, the fire poker still gripped in his hand. The shadows in the room began to detach themselves from the baseboards. They pooled on the floor like spilled ink, swirling together to form shapes that looked like people. The silhouettes of a woman in a sun hat, an old man with a cane, a child holding a ball. They didn't attack. They simply stood there, flickering in and out of existence, a gallery of the forgotten. The tension reached its breaking point around 3 a.m., the dead hour. Julian had drifted into a light, fitful sleep when a sudden drop in temperature woke him. The air was so thin it hurt to breathe. At the foot of his bed stood a figure. It wasn't a shadow or a mist, but a solid, towering presence. It was the Hollow Man, draped in a tattered coat that looked like his grandfather Silas's old gardening jacket. In its hand, it held one of the glass jars from the basement, the empty one that had Julian's name on it. The entity didn't speak with its own voice. Instead, it used the voice of Julian's father, a man who had passed away years ago. "It's time to come home, Julian," the thing whispered, the jar glowing with a sickly, hungry light. "You don't need these memories. They are heavy. They are painful. Give them to us, and you will finally be light." The figure leaned forward, and Julian saw that where its face should have been, there was only a swirling vortex of gray smoke, pulling at the very air in the room. In that moment of absolute terror, Julian realized a fundamental truth. The entity fed on the avoidance of the past. It thrived in the silence Silas had created. To run was to feed it. To hide was to strengthen it. With a shout that was part defiance and part desperation, Julian swung the fire poker. He didn't strike the entity, he struck the glowing jar in its hand. The glass shattered, and for a second, the room was filled with a blinding golden light that smelled like fresh rain and summer grass. The entity recoiled, letting out a sound that wasn't a laugh or a scream, but the sound of a great weight falling into a deep well. It dissolved back into the shadows, and the temperature in the room began to stabilize. The figures in the hallway vanished, and the reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror returned to its proper, synchronized state. Julian sat on the floor, shaking, but for the first time since he had opened that basement door, the ringing in his ears was silent. The moral of this harrowing night is that confronting fear is the first step toward overcoming it. Julian had tried to hide from the legacy of his grandfather, and in doing so, he had become its victim. By facing the entity and refusing the mercy of forgetting, he had claimed his own mind back. However, the battle was far from over. The house was still standing, and the cellar was still open. Julian looked at the shards of the broken jar on the floor. He realized he couldn't stay in his room and hope for the sun to save him. He needed answers. He needed to know why Silas had started this collection in the first place, and more importantly, how to end it. As the first hint of a gray Maryland dawn touched the horizon, Julian knew he had to go into town. The townspeople of this rural valley knew more than they were telling. They were the ones whose memories were in those jars. And as he looked at his own hands, he saw a faint, silver glow beneath his fingernails. The entity hadn't taken his memories, but it had left something behind. A mark. The basement was calling him back, and next time he wouldn't be going down alone. The drive into the heart of the Monocacy Valley felt like navigating through a dream that was slowly turning into a nightmare. Julian's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, the silver glow beneath his fingernails pulsing in rhythm with the engine's hum. The Maryland morning was overcast, the sun a pale, sickly coin hidden behind a veil of gray clouds. As he pulled into the small town of Oakhaven, a place that had stood still for a century, the familiar sights of the general store and the brick post office felt alien. It was as if a thin layer of frost had settled over his childhood memories, making everything look familiar yet entirely untouchable. Julian stopped at Miller's General Store, a place where he had bought cherry licorice every summer as a boy. He walked inside, the bell above the door chiming with a cheerful sound that felt like a mockery of the ringing he had heard in the basement. Behind the counter sat Mr. Miller, a man who had known Julian's father since they were in diapers. Julian forced a smile, hoping for a shred of normalcy. "Morning, Mr. Miller. Rough weather coming in, isn't it?" Julian said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. The old man looked up from his ledger, but his eyes didn't spark with recognition. There was no "How's your grandfather?" or "You've grown a foot, Julian." Instead, Miller's gaze was flat and empty, like a pond frozen over in midwinter. "Can I help you with something, traveler?" the man asked, his tone polite but entirely detached. Julian felt a cold spike of dread in his chest. "Mr. Miller, it's me, Julian, Silas Blackwood's grandson. I used to come in here every Saturday." Miller tilted his head, a frown creasing his brow. "Blackwood? I remember the name on the old manor, but Silas, he didn't have any kin left." "You must be mistaken, son." Panic began to rise in Julian's throat. He left the store without buying a thing, the bell chiming behind him like a funeral knell. He hurried across the street to the local historical society, a small, ivy-covered library that housed the county's oldest records. He needed to understand what the Hollow Man was and why the town seemed to be leaking its own history. If the entity fed on memories, it wasn't just taking them from the jars in the basement, it was harvesting them from the living. Inside the library, the smell of damp parchment and floor wax was overwhelming. He was met by Mrs. Gable, a woman whose family had lived in the valley since the Revolutionary War. Unlike Mr. Miller, Mrs. Gable didn't look at him with confusion. She looked at him with profound, silent pity. She didn't ask for his name. She simply beckoned him toward the back of the archives, where the light of the lamps didn't quite reach. "You opened it, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice a fragile reed in the wind. "The seal in the cellar. You let the hunger out." She pulled a heavy, leather-bound volume from a shelf labeled Folk Traditions of the Piedmont. The pages were yellowed and brittle. She pointed to a sketch of a figure that looked exactly like the one Julian had seen in his room. A tall, featureless man draped in a shifting cloak of mist. "In the old days, they called him the Memory Eater or the Hollow Man," Mrs. Gable explained. "He isn't a ghost. He is a void. He was born from the collective grief of the valley during the Great Famine of the 1800s. People wanted to forget their pain, their lost children, their empty bellies. So, they offered those memories to the soil. The conflict of the town's history began to unfold before him. Julian learned that his grandfather, Silas, hadn't been a villain or a thief. He had been a scribe, a man chosen by the town to contain the entity. Silas had realized that if the Hollow Man was allowed to roam free, the entire valley would eventually become a place of mindless shadows, where mothers forgot their sons and husbands forgot their wives. Silas had built the basement as a prison, using the glass jars to bait the entity with specific, beautiful memories, keeping it occupied and sated in the dark so it wouldn't devour the whole town. But a prison only works if someone is holding the key, Mrs. Gable said, her eyes filling with tears. When Silas got old, he knew he couldn't keep the balance. He sealed the door with concrete and iron, hoping the entity would starve to death in the silence. But the Hollow Man doesn't die. It only waits. And now that you've given it a crack to breathe through, it's starting with you, Julian. It's eating the town's memory of you first, because you're the strongest link to its cage. The scary realization hit Julian like a physical blow. He looked out the library window and saw Mr. Miller standing on the sidewalk, looking at Julian's parked car with a puzzled expression, as if he couldn't remember why it was there. The silver glow on Julian's fingernails flared bright. He wasn't just being hunted. He was being erased. If he didn't act soon, he would become a ghost while he was still breathing. A man with no name and no past, wandering a town that had no room for him. The resolution of the afternoon came with a heavy choice. Mrs. Gable handed him a small, iron key that she had kept hidden in a locket. This opens the scribe's ledger, hidden beneath the floorboards of the basement desk. Your grandfather knew this day might come. He didn't want you to inherit the house, Julian. He wanted you to inherit the responsibility. You have to decide. Will you run and let the valley fade into gray, or will you become the new keeper? The moral of this discovery was clear. Selflessness is the strongest shield against greed. Silas hadn't been a cold, distant man out of malice. He had sacrificed his own happiness and his own reputation to be the silent guardian of the town's soul. He had lived a lonely life so that others could remember the faces of their loved ones. Julian realized that his curiosity had been a form of greed, a desire to possess secrets he wasn't prepared to guard. Now, he had to decide if he was brave enough to give up his own life to save the memories of people who were already forgetting him. As Julian walked back to his car, he noticed that the silver glow had moved up to his wrists. The ringing in his ears returned, but it was accompanied by a new sensation. A pull, like a compass needle pointing toward the Blackwood estate. The house was calling its new master home. He looked back at Mrs. Gable, but she was already turning away, her eyes vacant as if she had already forgotten the conversation they'd just had. The town of Oakhaven was slipping away into the fog. Julian got into his car and turned the key. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of returning to that dark, whispering basement made his blood turn to ice. The entity was waiting for him, and it had a jar with his name on it. The sky over Maryland turned a deep, bruised purple as evening approached. Julian drove toward the estate, knowing that by the time the moon rose, he might be the only person left who remembered the name Julian Blackwood. The road back to the Blackwood estate felt like a narrowing throat. The Maryland fog had thickened into a soup of gray and white, clinging to the windshield of Julian's car like damp wool. Every landmark he had known, the crooked fence post at the edge of the property, the ancient sycamore tree that marked the driveway, seemed to have shifted or softened, as if the world were being erased by a giant, invisible hand. The silver glow on his skin had now crept up to his forearms, tingling with a pins and needles sensation that made his skin feel tight and alien. He was no longer just a visitor in this valley. He was becoming part of its forgotten ledger. When he finally pulled up to the house, it didn't look like a building anymore. Under the waning light of the afternoon, the manor seemed to pulse. The wooden siding didn't just sit there. It appeared to expand and contract in a slow, rhythmic heave, like the flanks of a great, tired beast. The windows were dark and wet, reflecting nothing but the gray void of the sky. Julian stepped out of the car, the iron key from Mrs. Gable heavy in his pocket. The ringing in his ears had transformed into a low, thumping vibration that matched the beat of his own heart, or perhaps the house had adopted his pulse as its own. As he crossed the threshold, the front door didn't creak. It sighed. The air inside was thick with the scent of wet earth and old, forgotten perfume. Julian switched on his flashlight, but the beam struggled to penetrate the gloom. The hallway had grown longer, the proportions of the house stretching into impossible geometries. The stairs to the second floor seemed to lead into a ceiling that wasn't there, and the kitchen doorway felt miles away. He realized the Hollow Man was no longer confined to the basement. It was redesigning the house to be a labyrinth, a trap designed to keep him wandering until there was nothing left of him to remember. Julian forced his feet to move toward the pantry. Every floorboard he stepped on felt soft, like treading on moss-covered logs in a Maryland swamp. As he neared the heavy hutch he had pushed in front of the basement door, he heard it, a voice. It wasn't the discordant choir of the townspeople, nor was it the hollow echo of his father. It was a voice he knew from the deepest recesses of his childhood. It was Silas. "Julian? Is that you, boy?" The voice whispered, coming from somewhere deep within the walls themselves. "I'm so cold, Julian. I'm so tired of the dark. Please come down. Help your grandfather." The sound was so clear, so laced with the specific, gravelly warmth of the man who had raised him, that Julian felt tears prick his eyes. For a moment, his fear was replaced by a desperate, aching hope. Could Silas still be down there? Could his grandfather be trapped in the mist, waiting for a savior? He pushed the hutch aside with a strength born of adrenaline. The concrete seal was gone, vanished as if it had never existed, leaving only the dark, yawning mouth of the stairwell. "Grandpa!" Julian called out, his voice cracking. "I'm coming. Just hold on." He began the descent, but the stairs were different now. He counted 10 steps, then 20, then 50. He looked back up, but the kitchen light was a tiny, distant pinprick of white. He looked down, and the darkness was a bottomless well. The walls of the stairwell were pulsing now, the rhythm faster and more frantic. Beneath the wood, he could hear a sound like thousands of insects scurrying, the sound of the memory mist flowing through the veins of the house. "Almost there, Julian," the voice of Silas urged, now sounding just a few feet ahead. "I have a gift for you, a memory of your mother. Don't you want to see her face again?" Julian stopped. The mention of his mother sent a cold shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. His mother had died when he was an infant. He had no memories of her, only the stories Silas had told him. The entity was dangling the one thing it knew Julian couldn't resist, a piece of his own missing identity. But as he stood on the infinite stairs, he remembered Mrs. Gable's warning. The Hollow Man was a void that fed on grief. It didn't give, it only took. The voice ahead didn't sound like a grandfather anymore. It sounded like a fisherman tugging on a line. A sudden violent sound shattered the hypnotic pull of the voice. From the darkness below, a series of sharp pops and crashes echoed up the stairwell. The jars were breaking. One by one, the preserved memories of Oakhaven were being liberated, not into the world, but into the maw of the Hollow Man. The entity was having a final feast, preparing itself for the arrival of its new host. The ringing in Julian's ears became a roar of static, and the walls of the staircase began to bleed a thick, pearlescent fluid that smelled of ozone and ancient roses. Julian realized he was being lured into the center of the web. He didn't run down. He stood his ground and pulled out the iron key. He closed his eyes, blocking out the deceptive voice of Silas and the shifting walls. He focused on the weight of the key and the reality of the task ahead. He had to reach the desk. He had to find the ledger. The entity wasn't a family member. It was a parasite using his love as a weapon. With a roar of defiance, Julian didn't continue down the stairs. He jumped. He didn't fall forever. The infinite stairs were an illusion of the mind. He landed hard on the stone floor of the basement, his flashlight rolling away to illuminate the heavy oak desk in the center of the room. The hollow man was there, standing over the desk, its misty form flickering with the stolen light of 1,000 broken jars. It lunged at him, its fingers like cold smoke, but Julian rolled toward the desk, his hand searching for the loose floorboard Mrs. Gable had described. The moral of this harrowing descent is that discernment is the only compass in the dark. We are often lured toward our own destruction by the things we most desire to hear, the voices of the past, the promises of lost joy, or the comfort of a lie. Julian had to learn to distinguish the truth of his mission from the deception of his heart. Had he followed the voice of his grandfather, he would have walked into the void. By trusting his purpose instead of his ears, he had reached the final battlefield. Julian's fingers caught the edge of a board. He yanked it back, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a massive iron-bound book, the scribe's ledger. The moment his hand touched the cover, the pulsing in the walls stopped. The hollow man let out a hiss of pure, cold air, recoiling from the book like a shadow from a flame. But the jars were still breaking, and the silver glow on Julian's skin had reached his neck. He was at the heart of the manor, holding the only weapon that mattered. But as he looked at the first page of the ledger, he realized the price of sealing the basement was even higher than he had imagined. The basement of Blackwood Manor had ceased to be a mere room. It was now a throat, and the world was being swallowed whole. Julian knelt on the cold stone floor, the scribe's ledger spread open before him. The pages were not paper, but thin sheets of hammered silver, and the ink was a dark, pulsing violet that seemed to move as he read. The silver glow on his skin had reached his jawline now, a cold numbness creeping into his face. He was fading, his very essence being converted into the same mist that filled the jars. He knew that if the glow reached the crown of his head, Julian Blackwood would vanish from the earth, leaving behind only a nameless shell for the hollow man to inhabit. The ledger revealed the terrible truth of the ritual. To seal the vault of Blackwood was not a matter of masonry or iron. It was a matter of tethering. The hollow man was a storm of unowned memories, and a storm needs an anchor. The scribe is the chain, the book whispered in a voice that resonated in Julian's mind. To close the door, the scribe had to offer a living memory, a piece of themselves so strong and so vibrant that the entity would be drawn to it like a moth to a furnace. Once the entity was focused on that single memory, it could be trapped within the master jar. But there was a catch that made Julian's blood run cold. The seal could only be finalized from the inside. The conflict of the basement escalated as the hollow man realized its reign was being threatened. The shifting mass of gray smoke and stolen faces began to coalesce, taking on a terrifying, physical density. It no longer looked like a mist. It looked like a mountain of discarded lives. Thousands of eyes, blue, brown, green, and gray, opened across its surface, all staring at Julian with a hunger that was older than the state of Maryland itself. The entity let out a roar that was composed of 1,000 different screams, a cacophony of grief that nearly knocked Julian unconscious. "Give it to us," the voices shrieked. "Give us the boy who remembers. We want to be whole." Julian fumbled for the last unbroken jar, the one Silas had labeled with his name. It was the only vessel strong enough to hold the concentrated essence of the hollow man. He stood up, his legs shaking, and faced the mountain of faces. He held the jar aloft like a lantern. "You want a memory?" Julian shouted over the roar of the voices. "I'll give you one, but you'll have to come and take it." He focused all his will on a single moment from his childhood, not a grand event, but the simple memory of his grandfather Silas teaching him how to plant a sapling in the Maryland soil. He focused on the smell of the earth, the warmth of Silas's hand on his shoulder, and the feeling of hope for the future. The effect was instantaneous. The hollow man stopped its screaming. The thousands of eyes fixed on the jar in Julian's hand, which began to glow with a blinding, golden light as his memory poured into it. The entity surged forward, a tidal wave of smoke and sorrow, rushing toward the jar. It was a terrifying sight, a literal personification of the void trying to consume a single spark of love. Julian felt the air being sucked out of his lungs as the entity's presence surrounded him. The silver glow on his skin flared white-hot, and for a moment, he felt his own identity stretching, thinning, and almost snapping. The resolution of the struggle required a feat of pure, unadulterated bravery. As the mass of the hollow man began to funnel itself into the neck of the jar, drawn by the irresistible bait of Julian's love, the basement began to physically collapse. The ceiling groaned, and massive oak beams snapped like dry twigs. Julian had to stay until the very last wisp of the entity was inside the glass. He stood his ground as the house crumbled around him, the ringing in his ears reaching a deafening crescendo. With a final, desperate shove of his will, he slammed the silver lid onto the jar and locked it with the iron key Mrs. Gable had given him. The silence that followed was absolute. The shadows retracted, the pulsing in the walls died away, and the silver glow on Julian's skin began to recede, leaving behind a faint, permanent shimmer. The hollow man was trapped, condensed into a single, swirling vortex of dark violet mist within the jar. But the cost was evident. The stairs had collapsed, and the only exit was a narrow crawl space through the foundation that was rapidly being choked by falling debris. Julian looked at the jar, then at the ruins of his family's legacy. He was inside the tomb he had just finished sealing. The moral of this final descent is that bravery is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important. Julian could have run at any point. He could have let the town forget and saved himself. But he chose to risk everything. His life, his name, and his very soul, to protect the history of a valley that didn't even remember him. He had realized that a life without a past is not a life at all, and that some burdens must be carried so that others can walk light. As the dust settled in the ruined basement, Julian sat in the dark, clutching the jar to his chest. He could hear the wind howling through the gaps in the stone, a lonely Maryland wind that carried the scent of the coming winter. He was trapped, buried beneath the Blackwood estate, with nothing but a jar of captured nightmares to keep him company. But as he looked at the jar, he saw a tiny flicker of gold still shining in the center of the dark mist. His memory of Silas was still there, a pilot light in the darkness. He began to dig. His fingers were bloodied and his muscles screamed in protest, but he moved one stone at a time. He wasn't digging for his life. He was digging to ensure the jar never saw the light of day again. He had to find a place where the hollow man could be buried forever, far from the curiosity of future generations. But as he pushed aside a heavy foundation stone, he saw something that made his heart stop. It wasn't the way out. It was another door, one even older than the house itself, covered in ancient, indigenous symbols that predated the scribes. The weight of the Maryland soil above Julian felt like the hand of God pressing down on a sinner. In the suffocating darkness of the collapsed basement, the only light came from the jar clutched to his chest, a swirling violent violet that pulsed like a dying star. Before him stood the third door, an ancient slab of granite etched with symbols that predated the manor, the town, and perhaps even the language of men. These were symbols of the earth, of deep roots and silent places. Julian realized with a jolt of terror that his grandfather hadn't been the architect of this prison. Silas had merely been the most recent jailer of a structure that had existed since the mountains were young. The air in this deepest chamber was thin and smelled of wet minerals and time. As Julian reached out to touch the granite door, the symbols flared with a cold, blue light. He felt a sudden, telepathic rush of images. The Monocacy Valley as it was thousands of years ago, a place where the barrier between the world of the living and the world of the void was as thin as a dragonfly's wing. The Hollow Man was not a singular monster, but a leak, a tear in the fabric of reality that fed on the essence of human experience. Silas had been right to seal the basement, but Julian understood now that concrete and iron were never going to be enough. The conflict of the final hour began as the earth shifted again. The ruins of Blackwood Manor groaned above him, and a trickle of Maryland clay began to pour from the ceiling. Julian knew he couldn't leave the jar here. If the house were to be rebuilt or the land excavated in 100 years, the Hollow Man would be freed again, hungrier than ever. He looked at the granite door and saw a small, circular indentation in the center of the seal. It was the exact size of the base of his glass jar. The ancient jailers had left a place for the offering to be returned to the deep. With hands that shook with exhaustion and cold, Julian placed the jar into the indentation. The moment the glass touched the stone, the violet mist inside the jar began to scream, not with voices this time, but with a high-pitched frequency that shattered the remaining jars in the room. The granite door began to glow white-hot, and the symbols started to spin. Julian felt the silver glow on his skin being pulled toward the door, as if the ancient mechanism were trying to reclaim the mark the entity had left on him. It was a moment of choice. He could pull away and keep his mark, perhaps even his sanity, or he could give up the last of his connection to the void to ensure the seal was permanent. "For the valley," Julian whispered, his voice cracking in the dark. He pressed his palms against the glowing granite, offering the silver energy in his veins back to the earth. The sensation was like being unmade. Every memory he had ever held, his first bicycle, the taste of a Maryland crab cake, the sound of the river in spring, flashed before his eyes as if being judged. The stone drank the energy hungrily, with a final, thunderous thud that vibrated through the very bedrock of the county. The granite door sank into the floor, dragging the jar and the Hollow Man down into a darkness so deep that light could never follow. The resolution was sudden and silent. The pressure in Julian's ears vanished. The ringing that had haunted him since he arrived at the estate was replaced by the beautiful, mundane sound of water dripping from a pipe. A gap opened in the foundation above him, a jagged smile of gray morning light cutting through the dust. Julian scrambled upward, his fingers clawing at the Maryland mud, pulling himself through the wreckage of the pantry and out onto the wet grass of the lawn. He lay there for a long time, breathing in the cold, honest air of the Monocacy Valley. Behind him, the Blackwood estate was a tomb of splinters and stone. The house had folded in on itself, the basement completely swallowed by a sinkhole that looked as if the earth had simply closed its mouth. Julian stood up, his clothes tattered and his spirit weathered, but he was alive. He looked down at his hands. The silver glow was gone, replaced by the honest grime of hard work. He walked to his car, and as he drove back toward Oakhaven, the fog began to lift. When he entered Miller's general store one last time, the bell chimed. Mr. Miller looked up from his paper, and this time, his eyes brightened with a spark of recognition. "Julian, good heavens, boy, you look like you've been wrestling with a mountain. What happened to your clothes?" The town was remembering. The connection had been restored. Julian smiled, A tired, genuine smile. "Just a bit of landscaping, Mr. Miller." The old house didn't want to stand anymore. He bought a bottle of water and a map, knowing that his time in this valley was done. He had fulfilled the legacy of the scribe. The moral of this long and terrifying journey is that we are the keepers of our ancestors' legacies, both the light and the dark. Silas had left Julian a burden, but in carrying it, Julian had found a strength he never knew he possessed. He had learned that to protect the future, one must sometimes face the deepest shadows of the past. He left Maryland that day with a newfound respect for the things that stay hidden, and the silence required to keep the world safe. The final twist came a week later, when Julian was staying in a small hotel in Virginia. He stood before the bathroom mirror to shave, his mind finally at peace. But as he wiped the steam from the glass, he froze. His eyes in the reflection were his own, but for a fleeting second, the way he tilted his head, the way his brow furrowed, was exactly like Silas. And as he looked deeper into his own pupils, he saw a tiny golden flicker, the memory of the sapling safe and sound. He smiled at his reflection, but then he noticed something else. On the very edge of the mirror's frame, in the corner where the shadow was darkest, a small silver chime echoed in the quiet room. Julian didn't panic. He simply turned off the light. He knew the price of silence, and he was more than willing to pay it.